Okay, let's do this. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a couple of things that I think need to be addressed. So let's start with a story. This is a story from, actually, it's not even really a story that happened to me. It's a story that I heard. So I heard the story while I was in the Army, but it has very widespread applications for any organization. So I would have heard this story in 2014, right? So, 9 years ago. And I was a major in the Army. At the time, I was part of the 10th Mountain Division, so I was stationed in Fort Drum, New York. And I was on brigade staff. And for those of you who know what a brigade is, if you don't, it doesn't matter. So I kind of worked with and for another major, interestingly enough. That happens sometimes in the Army. I've been on both sides of it, where I was a junior major and technically my direct boss was like a senior major. That's kind of how it was in this situation. And then there are other times when I was a more senior major and I had junior majors, and technically I was their boss, and I wrote their eval reports. Sometimes that happens. You're a major for a long time. I mean, I was a major for exactly 7 years to the day. So there's a huge difference between a year one major and a year seven major. Same thing when you're a captain. You're a captain forever as well. So my buddy, who's also kind of my boss, right? He told me a story about him and his brother. And I thought it was a fantastic story. It's kind of funny, but it's also very true. So he's kind of a senior major. He has a younger brother who's only a couple of years younger than him, but his brother entered the Army as an officer a little later than my buddy had. And so they're only a couple of years apart in age, but in terms of their Army careers, there's like 10 years difference between the two of them. So whereas my buddy is a major, kind of a senior major, his younger brother is a lieutenant. So they're at home. They're both at home. Now, I'm pretty sure these guys were at totally different duty stations, because I don't think his little brother was at Fort Drum. His little brother was somewhere else in a completely different unit, in a completely different part of the country. I'm assuming, as far as I can remember. But they're at home. Maybe it's Christmas or whatever, but they're both home, and they're talking, and his little brother is complaining about his unit. Now, his little brother, who's a lieutenant, is complaining about his battalion, whereas my buddy, his older brother, is like a battalion operations officer at the time. So he's got a lot more experience, but also he works at the level of the battalion. If you're a battalion operations officer, you would be the third most senior officer in the entire battalion. And a battalion might easily be 500, even more soldiers. So the younger brother, the lieutenant, is complaining about his battalion, whatever, which is very typical. Like, that's very common. And he says something, and then my buddy, the older brother, says to him, "That's such a dumb lieutenant remark to make." Which I thought was a very funny story, because I can very easily see how that happens. But my buddy's purpose in telling that story, and his intent, behind saying to his brother, like, "Hey, that's such a dumb lieutenant remark to make," right? Or, "That's such a dumb lieutenant comment." What he was saying was, you don't even know what you're talking about. You're a lieutenant, you're a platoon leader or whatever, which is, a very important position for sure. But you're going to complain about things that are happening in the battalion when your perspective is very limited. And there are some great, platoon leaders out there, but like, I did that stuff when I was a lieutenant, where I would complain about, now everyone does this. Like, it's very natural in the Army and in most organizations, but in the Army, I mean, it's known. There's always going to be tension between a unit and then the higher headquarters, and particularly a unit and the staff of the higher headquarters. There's some natural tension that exists there, and to some degree that can even be healthy, as long as it's managed well. But my point in sharing this story is, one, it's kind of funny. And my buddy, when he told me the story, he was like, hey, my brother and me, there's only a couple of years between us. But then according to our Army experience, there's more like a decade between us. And it shows when, he makes comments like that are not indicative of his age. They're indicative of his relative inexperience in the Army. So I wrote a piece on my Substack. And again, you can find my Substack. I'll put the link below to this specific piece, but it was called In Defense of Bosses. And it was kind of, I thought I was offering a helpful perspective, but it was kind of meant to be taken lightheartedly. But that said, my purpose behind it was, everyone always assumes, like kind of in culture, I'm not talking about like within your organization necessarily, though perhaps, but generally in culture, like kind of our everyday understanding, or even the depiction of organizations in movies or TV shows or whatever, the boss is incompetent, right? That's like a kind of a running type of, trope or whatever that we might see in, like I said, in movies or wherever. Okay. So, that has not necessarily been my experience. I have, 19 years in the military, and I, with extremely few exceptions, worked for remarkable bosses. And I say this as someone who left the military because, you guys know why. So, and many of those people that are still in, I actually have kind of lost a lot of respect for. But, and this is going to sound weird, that doesn't mean that they were bad bosses per se. It certainly does not mean that they're incompetent. Now, many of these people are complete cowards. They are like the ones who are still in, total cowards, do not understand their oath to the Constitution. Now, does that make them incompetent? I wouldn't say so. Some of these individuals are extremely smart, like extremely smart, very tactically savvy, very cerebral. I have some real problems kind of with their strategic understanding and their ability to think in complexity. I do have some real problems with that, but that's because their worldview is warped, and we're going to talk about that. So to me, this is a nuanced concept, but I think where I was in the military, and this is kind of what I tried to explain when I wrote this piece called In Defense of Bosses. And I'm actually going to look at it real quick, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You can go read it. But what I am going to do is I'm going to just mention just a couple of things that I wrote in the piece, because this is going to be important for what we're actually going to talk about, right? So the piece is called A Defense of Bosses. I think I said it was In Defense of Bosses, but I actually called it A Defense of Bosses. And here are a couple of things that I outlined, right, that we should all keep in mind vis-a-vis our bosses, right? So number one, your boss is the boss for a reason, okay? Now, we all want to feel like, oh, he shouldn't be in his job or whatever. There are times when that's probably true. As long as your organization is functional, then that's the exception rather than the rule. Number two, it's your boss's job to think unemotionally. So there are going to be times when you disagree with your boss. Not exactly his job. Now, he doesn't have to have some sort of inhuman disregard for you, but it is his job to think unemotionally. It's probably your job too, to some degree. Your boss probably has a boss, unless you work in some sort of small organization where your boss is the the CEO or the owner or whatever. He likely has a boss. The majority of bosses out there also have a boss, right? The forest versus the trees, and what's your responsibility with regard to the forest or the trees, and what's your boss's responsibility, right? Is your boss more of a generalist than you're expected to be, and are you expected to be more of a specialist than he is? Also, the delicate balance between productivity and people. This kind of goes back to what I mentioned before about thinking unemotionally. Your boss may have different things that he has to juggle, more than just you or more than people's feelings. Now, that doesn't mean that decisions are entirely detached from people's feelings. I'm not saying that at all. That should not be the case. And in fact, your boss is a human too. So that's 6 things right there. Your boss is the boss for a reason. It's your boss's job to think unemotionally. Your boss probably has a boss. The forest versus the trees, the delicate balance between productivity and people, and your boss is human too, which means he's not going to be perfect. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? I always think it's funny that again, there exists kind of this almost this running joke that like everyone can do their job better than their boss. Like, okay, does that mean is that really true? Can you, or I mean, I'm sorry, that everyone can do their boss's job better than their boss and that their boss is totally incompetent. Okay. All right. Again, that has not been my experience. I had fantastic bosses. And I know that sounds weird because the ones who are still in right now, I absolutely would not work for them again. But not because they're incompetent. It's because they're cowards and because they went along with this unlawful mandate and because they have no idea. Either they're cowards or they just lack the strategic thinking ability to understand what the true threats are that you know, are the actual menace to our freedoms right now. We're going to talk about that. So I realize this is complicated, and I realize it sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because on the one hand, I say these guys are not incompetent. They're actually highly, highly, highly intelligent people. And I do believe that. And on the other hand, I say, but I don't want to work for them again. And I'm even critiquing their strategic thinking ability. Okay. Again, this is a nuanced topic, you know? And I'm going to explain my worldview here in a second because this is important because I allude to it a lot and I need people to understand where I'm coming from. And why we're talking about incompetence kind of being a cop-out or us using incompetence as an excuse and that being a cop-out. Now, I'm talking about in general organizations. I don't even like the incompetence, you know, cop-out. But that doesn't mean to say that incompetence doesn't exist. Of course, there's incompetence out there. And maybe you do have an incompetent boss. I don't know. Maybe you are an incompetent boss. I don't know. But I'm not saying incompetence is non-existent. I mean, that would be ridiculous. I'm not saying that at all. But let's talk about worldview for a second, and then let's try and link these two together. So I wrote a piece also on Substack. So that first piece was called A Defense of Bosses, and this piece is called Belief to Action. And if you think that that's some sort of new ager title, then you don't know me. I am not a new ager at all. I also do not believe in some sort of like Gnostic dualism, and that's a topic for a different day. But if you read some of my pieces where I talk about truth, I try to make that very I think I'm having a microphone issue here. Okay, hopefully it's not sometimes when I use my microphone, it'll try and switch back and forth. I don't know why it does that between like my external microphone and then the internal one. It's kind of a pain. But anyway, I think we're good now. So I wrote a piece called Belief to Action. That is not a new ager title at all. What it is my attempt to make a connection between what we believe and therefore one, our decision comes to acting, and then also, okay, so I laid out a lot of stuff that I'm just not going to be able to go through here. But what I lay out is, okay, there's got to be in like our topology or our worldview, and I'm just going to use the term worldview. All right, I just unplugged the external microphone, so if I sound a little bit different or the sound quality has changed, it is what it is. Sorry about that. You guys let me know. Let me know if you could
could note the sound change now that I just took out the external microphone, because it was, again, for whatever reason, my computer was trying to switch back and forth. That happens sometimes. Anyway, so I don't want to get into a discussion between the difference between cosmology and worldview. I'm just going to use the term worldview, and I typically do. But for me, cosmology is more expansive. It's your view on, what you believe about the universe and its origin, and things that may lie outside of time and space, right? Worldview can be scoped down a little bit, though sometimes people use the words interchangeably. I don't mean to get into like a theological discussion today, so I'm just going to use the term worldview. But regardless, my theological beliefs heavily inform my worldview. But even if you don't share my theological beliefs, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would either not understand or even necessarily disagree completely with my worldview. Though you might disagree with some of the foundational reasons as to why I hold that worldview. But anyway, so there's a relationship between your cosmology or your worldview and then epistemology. So what's epistemology? Epistemology is just a big philosophical word for what the limits of human knowledge are and how we arrive at that knowledge. So how do we know what we know? And then if you're talking about beliefs, well, how do we even get to the beliefs that we have or maintain those beliefs? Now, again, you start talking about religion, you start talking about things like faith, etc., right? And then action. So why do we take the actions that we take? Or if you want to look at it from the alternate perspective, what impedes us from taking action when we perhaps should take action? Because one of the problems that we have right now in our society is that we have a lot of lazy people. And I don't mean like they're physically lazy, though a lot of them are. But they're mentally lazy, they're psychologically lazy, they are spiritually lazy. And that's a problem. Like, that is going to affect the way in which our society can defend itself spiritually, psychologically, and yes, physically. So there's a relationship between what we believe and then the way in which we choose to act. And that's what I tried to lay out in this piece, that in my Substack piece that is called Belief to Action. So the problem is there is also worldview warfare that is being perpetrated against us. Now, I'm not the person who invented that term, worldview warfare. In fact, the Germans even have a specific word for it, which, go read my piece, Belief to Action, and you'll see it. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it in German. But you can find it in the piece that I wrote. But if you look at the definition for how the Germans defined the word, it's very closely akin to what we would call psychological warfare. But I actually really like the term worldview warfare, because I think that what we think of when we think of the term psychological warfare, in my mind, I think that the average person's understanding of what that is more limited than what they might think or what might come to mind if they were to hear the term worldview warfare, which a lot of people have not even necessarily heard. So what is worldview warfare? Well, worldview warfare is a type of very comprehensive psychological warfare that is meant to impair your worldview, your view of the way in which the world works. And yes, that could include your understanding of faith-based issues, theological issues. Do you think? Now, I'm certainly a Christian. I mean, part of the reason that I do what I do is because I believe in the concept of being a Christian man of action. I don't apologize for that. That is first and foremost in my mind. That is the most important thing to me. That doesn't mean that I go around pretending to be some, great, fantastic, perfect person. I mean, no, absolutely not. Far from it. But but I'm trying to explain where I'm coming from. So I believe in God. I believe the truth comes from God, you know? I also believe that we live in a fallen world, right? And I believe that evil exists in this world, and evil cannot really fight against God. I don't think that's what happens. I don't think God in any way feels threatened by evil. I think evil fights against us. Well, what is evil? Evil is the absence of good in a way that, and I've written about this on my Substack with the pieces that I've written about truth. You can find those too. But, cold is the absence of heat. Dark is the absence of light. I mean, you probably learned that somewhere along the way in like, I don't know, middle school science class or whatever. Generally speaking, we speak of heat and cold as if they're opposites. They're not technically opposites, scientifically speaking. Light and dark are not technically opposites, scientifically speaking. Good and evil are not technically opposites. We tend to speak in this binary construct where we have good and evil. As I said at the outset, I do not in any way hold a type of belief in some sort of Gnostic dualism, which claims some sort of ontological equipotency between good and evil. That's a word salad there, and I understand that. But my point is that I don't believe that, good and evil, that like if you were to try and put that, like represent that on a Cartesian plane or on some sort of number line, you can't say that good is at point 10, like positive 10, and that evil is at point negative 10, because that would mean that like the two of them together cancel out. That would mean that evil is as like has the same value as good, but in the opposite direction. Okay. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not a math major here, right? I'm just trying to make an analogy. My point is that whatever value you want to ascribe to good, I don't know, maybe you want to say it's infinity, whatever. But like that doesn't, but evil is not the same number just with a negative sign in front of it. Because that would mean that the two in terms of value were the same, just one's positive and one's negative. This is extremely hard to explain. I understand that. But my point is that evil is not a threat to God. Evil is very much a threat to us. Okay. But I believe evil exists in this world. I believe there is a lot of evil. And I believe the Bible explains that very, very, very clearly. And this has gone on for thousands of years. And some of the absolutely horrendous things that used to happen in the ancient world that are described in the Bible, I believe that many of those practices have never gone away, and I believe that they still exist and they are still conducted. I believe people don't want to know that, but they're conducted. And I believe that the war that we find ourselves in, and I've probably used the term where I've said this is a war between good and evil. I try not to use that term for the exact reasons that I just explained. But, you'll also catch me talking about heat and cold sometimes as if they're opposites, just because that's in our everyday parlance, that's kind of how we speak, right? So I'm sure at times I've referred to this as a war between good and evil. That's not extremely precise, though. What's much more precise, I think, is to say that this is a spiritual war, and this spiritual war is executed along various modalities. So it very much exists physically. But it also exists psychologically. It also exists, yes, philosophically. And maybe even a better term would be theologically, and I very much believe that. So I believe that a lot of the psychological warfare that is conducted against us is perhaps better understood as worldview warfare. And there are so many people right now that have their worldview, they are operating on an incomplete worldview for various reasons. And I'll tell you one of them. And this is going to sound, the big C word, right? The word that gets weaponized against us, if you talk about things in a conspiratorial light, people want to, call you a kook. The people who are doing that, because that term has purposefully been like weaponized, right? The people who call you a kook generally are operating on a flawed worldview. That does not mean that every so-called conspiracy out there is true or legitimate or accurate. In fact, I think plenty of them are seeded purposefully, like among the public, to kind of discredit those that are actually accurate, right? I mean, there's a ton of deception going on out there. Go read my Substack that's called, I think it's called Deception, and then the subtitle is something like Information, Truth, and Dialectics. I think that may be it. Sometimes I forget the titles that I put on these pieces that I've written, several months ago. But I mean, there's a lot of energy is put into deceiving us. And this deception is not new. That's my point, is it's been going on since like Old Testament time, And those who engage in this against us are very sophisticated in the mechanisms of deception that they use against us. So like, do I believe that there are evil entities? And again, I'm kind of I'm speaking here in a theological way. Do I believe that there are evil entities that operate against us? Yes. Do I believe that there are evil people, humans, under the influence or even deliberately seeking the assistance of these entities to operate against us? Yes. I don't pretend to know how that works. I don't pretend to know whether they do it knowingly or unknowingly. My assumption is that some of them do it quite knowingly, especially those kind of towards the top of this this organizational, what would be like a dark hierarchy. And there's plenty of literature out there that explains this. I'm not going to go into all of this right now. I'm just giving you an overview of my worldview. I believe the Bible tells us that the world is ruled by, the evil one. I believe that. I see a lot of evidence of that. And I think a lot of people don't, like Christians, I think they don't actually believe that. They think they believe that. And if you were to ask them if they believe that, they would say, yes, I believe that the world is controlled by evil. They don't actually know what that means. I believe that the world is far more evil than what we see on the surface. And I think but the reason that a lot of it operates beneath the surface is because we can't see it because of the worldview warfare being perpetrated against us, And the worldview warfare is part of this like overarching spiritual warfare, again, that is being executed against us. So do I believe that there is one evil group that controls the world, and decisions are made in some sort of, I don't know, some sort of room or cave somewhere. I'm not necessarily saying that, because I think there's a lot of factional infighting that goes on within this group or groups. But I do believe that there is an evil core somewhere of people or groups, and there may be, I think there is some factional infighting, and there may be groups that kind of compete with each other. So I'm not saying there's one central organization and there's like some sort of like a central command element. But there may be something that kind of approximates that. I'm speaking to you in with a ton of conjecture here, but I have done a lot of reading on this, and I'm also just telling you that to some degree, someone's planning all of this. I mean, take what just happened over the last couple of years. Every single country in the world, with very few exceptions, and the countries that were exceptions, the presidents got assassinated. I mean, look at Tanzania, for example, right? Just one example. There were a couple of others. But virtually every country in the world went along with a narrative of sheer bullshit. And Brad Miller is not the smartest guy in the world. And if I knew it was bullshit, then there are people out there besides just, Joseph Magufuli of Tanzania that also knew that it was bullshit. So someone controls the governments of the world. I mean, I'm not here to tell you who. I'm not here to tell you exactly how that works. I'm not here to tell you that it's literally every single government. I'm not here to tell you that whoever this group or groups are, that their control over the world is absolute. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that their control is dominant. It is vast, and they do control not just the governments, but also the corporations. So part of my worldview is I don't think we live in the Westphalian global order that we think we live in. So what's that, right? Okay, so the Treaty of Westphalia, signed almost 400 years ago. I think it was 1648. Is that when the 30 Years' War ended? 1648. But what I'm referring to is kind of the Westphalian. So that Treaty of Westphalia. When I refer to the Westphalian global order, I'm referring to our concept of the political idea of the state. Now, a lot of times as Americans, we get confused with that term state because we tend not to equate the term state and country, because we believe that state, like I live in Tennessee, is subordinate to the country. And that's both incomplete and also kind of incorrect. So you might look at other countries which instead of states, they have like provinces or departments or whatever, right? We have states. But it also shows like a terrible understanding of the concept of federalism and a terrible understanding of the reason in which I think it was Thomas Jefferson who chose the term state. And why he chose the term state? Well, he chose the term state specifically because it was sovereign. So this goes back into how, we've bastardized the entire original concept of federalism, which was crucial to an understanding of the founding of our country, and that the states were the creators of the federal government, which was the creature of those creators, the state. Anyway, but let's just talk about like the political state or country. Let's not get too crazy here, right? Let's talk in words that at least people will colloquially understand. So you think, okay, like a country, or technically a state, but whatever, like France, Japan, our own Mexico, wherever, right? So you take this country, it has a government, it has a geographical boundary, right? Borders, so you can tell where the state is. It probably has some sort of body of defense, whether it's a military or whatever, right? To protect its sovereignty and defend its natural borders, or defend its borders. So when you take like an undergrad international relations class or some sort of even a history class, you're going to learn that at least over the last 400 years or so, when we've been operating under this supposed Westphalian order, that the principal actors on the international stage, when it comes to like geopolitics, have been states. So you'll talk about, obviously this is much after the Treaty of Westphalia, but let's just talk about the last century. So like World War I, and you could pull out a map of 1914, which is going to look a lot different than today. And you can look at, okay, Well, who are the allies and who are the central powers? You can do the same thing a generation later for World War II, right? Okay, so who are the allies, who are the Axis powers? And you could take like a 1939 map and you could, figure out who was where on each side, et cetera, et cetera. But you're going to be talking about, states. Now, those states might have been empires, like like if you're talking about World War I, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or even the Ottoman Empire. But they were still states. I mean, there was a political entity, whether we're talking about a republic, a kingdom, an empire. They were political entities that were all states. And when you're taking kind of this undergrad level history class or international relations class, you're going to speak as states as if they are the principal actors on the global stage. Now, that does not mean that you won't also learn that there are non-state actors. I mean, there are terrorist organizations, there are, drug cartels, there are other like crime syndicates that may be super powerful. Some of them even, international in scope. There are extremely large corporations that span much of the globe and therefore have a lot of influence on the world stage, right? But that's about the extent to which your study is going to go. What you're not going to talk about is kind of what I'm talking about with my worldview, where there may be organizations that operate in the shadows that supersede and transcend. And when I say supersede, I'm not talking about supranational organizations like the United Nations. I'm talking about something that exists completely in the shadows that like totally controls, has infiltrated, supersedes, or to some degree completely transcends those supranational organizations, these political entities known as states, and even these corporations. That these leaders of these powerful states in the world, it's almost as if they receive their instructions from someone and they do what they're told, because if they don't, there may be consequences, which means that these shadow organizations, whoever they may be, probably control a ton of assets and can leverage some sort of power in an extreme way. What does that look like? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But I do believe that if you look back over the last century or so, there's plenty of information that shows us that the Cold War may not be exactly what we thought it was. World War II may not be exactly what we thought it was, or even World War I. That there may have been organizations in the shadow that were kind of manipulating things on both sides. And don't take my word for it. And if you think I'm crazy, okay, cool, that's cool. But just do a little bit of homework. What I'm asking you to do, and the reason I'm explaining this is, what I'm saying is, the world does not appear to work the way that many people have grown up thinking that it works. The president of the United States is not the most powerful person in the world. And I'm not talking about just because, I'm not talking about Biden, right? Or whomever, it doesn't matter. Who's your favorite president? I don't know. Whichever one you thought was, I don't know, the best president, doesn't matter. Whichever one you thought was the best, that person, we may call him the leader of the free world. For as long as we've all been around, and even earlier, those people have been controlled and manipulated to a large degree. It is what it is. That's now, I mean, could I be wrong? Sure, I suppose. In fact, I'm sure that there are things that I've told you about my beliefs since I started talking that are, I'm sure wrong about something, but a lot of this is conjecture. Like I'm admittedly telling you what I believe, what my worldview is, which includes a lot of opinion, a lot of conjecture, and some hypothesizing, for sure. but it's evidence-based. I mean, I've done a lot of reading. I've searched out the opinions and the claims of a lot of smart people who've studied this for a lot longer than I have. And I've studied it for, I don't know, 16 years, I think, since 2007, summer of 2007. There are people who have studied it a lot longer than I have. But let's also not discredit observation, right? Dot connecting, the recognition of patterns. That type of inductive reasoning is also extremely important, right? Things are not always going to be extremely clear cut. We have to be able to make decisions in a murky world amid incomplete data. And this worldview warfare that is being perpetrated against us is done to cloud the information we receive about the world. And therefore, it's going to impede our ability to process and critically evaluate the information that we receive. And a lot of that information is going to be disinformation or misinformation. There is a subtle difference between the two based on intent. So if there is an overarching intent, think about the media. If there is an overarching intent to block or distort information that we receive, which then degrades our ability to process and evaluate accurate information, then it's going to degrade our ability to challenge previously held thoughts or assumptions, which means we're not going to be able to challenge our own worldview. So much of life and progressing is challenging assumptions. I mean, this is actually one of the things that I was taught when I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies in the Army. Challenge assumptions, be a heretic, go against the orthodoxy. Don't accept the kind of the heuristic that you like, oh, well, this is the way we've always done it, therefore it must be the optimal way. That's not necessarily true. Now, it may be true. A lot of times people want to challenge the way something has been done because they think that it's only being done that way because it's always been done that way, and they challenge it. And then you realize, there's actually a reason why it's always been done that way, because it is the optimal way. But it may not be, right? It may be worth challenging that, for sure. But my problem was all these smart guys, all these cerebral thinkers, and they were very smart people who attended this course with me, don't get me wrong. And we did a lot of thinking, a lot of whiteboarding, and a lot of thinking about thinking, metacognition. And I agree so much with challenging assumptions, whether it be the way in which our military doctrine is crafted, and carried out. But we've seen in the medical community the exact same thing, right? We've seen in the medical community the exact same thing. So we have to be willing to challenge orthodoxies. But my problem when I was in this course was people weren't willing to go far enough when it came to challenging their assumptions. People are not going to challenge their worldview if they are unwilling to kind of arrive at a almost like an existential moment. And when I say existential, what I mean by that is kind of like psychologically existential. And I don't mean psychologically existential and to such a degree that you're going to go crazy over this. But what I mean is, when I first kind of woke up to what was going on in the summer of 2007, and I've explained before that it was kind of the big September event from 6 years earlier. I never know what I can or cannot say on YouTube that's going to get me kicked off, but you guys know what I'm talking about. And I mean, if they ban me on YouTube, you guys know I'm on Rumble, I'm on Odyssey, but it was psychologically jolting to me because I'm in the Army. I love my country. I'm a constitutionalist. I just got back from a year-long deployment in Afghanistan. So it was psychologically jolting, and I had to wrestle with that. I mean, I almost got out of the Army because of it. Yeah, I've told this story many times. That's what I mean by getting to that like psychologically existential moment in wrestling with that, wrestling with your own worldview. That's why I completely reject out of hand the claim that conspiracy theorists are closed-minded. That is absolutely untrue. I mean, I guess it could be true. I mean, I guess you could get some guys that go overboard, but here's the thing. Conspiracy theorists, again, that weaponized term, are by definition open-minded. And here's what I mean. They, or we are the ones who have had to challenge our own orthodoxies of thought that we maintained for a long time. You know, according to our upbringing, according to our education, according to our belief systems or whatever. We're the ones who have had to challenge that. We're the ones who have had to go find information that is hard to find, you know, go read the obscure books, go to the, you know, like the far corners of the internet with the independent journalists. I mean, there's a lot of crap out there. Don't get me wrong, on the internet, right? But there's a lot of truth out there on websites from independent journalists and researchers that is not heavily trafficked, right? The people who have the best, most accurate information are not the ones who are having millions of hits on their websites. You know, that's what I'm saying about having to go out there and like mine through a lot of information to get to the truth, and operating amid tons of conjecture and just trying to figure things out when it's like not clear who's telling the truth and what's going on, and trying to wade through like layers and layers of deception. It's very hard. But it's whoever they, you know, may be, it's going to be hard because it's worldview warfare. It's meant to break you down spiritually. It's meant to degrade your ability to think. It's meant to keep you in a perpetual state of confusion. It's meant to keep you in a perpetual state of fear. Once you at least recognize that and acknowledge that, you can take steps to breaking out of it. But if you don't, here's what's going to happen. You're going to resort to the path of least resistance. I mean, it's kind of human nature. Well, what's the path of least resistance? When you don't know what to do because you're confused and you don't know who to listen to, you're going to do what's the easiest. You're going to follow the path of least resistance, which means you're going to listen to the authority figures, you know, the self-appointed priests. I mean, it almost becomes like pseudo-religious. I mean, we saw that with what happened over the last couple of years, right? High Priest Fauci and, you know, all the others. If you follow the path of least resistance, you don't know who to listen to, you're going to end up listening to the authority figures. But if those authority figures are the ones who are trying to keep you in a state of confusion and in a state of fear, and ultimately in a state of enslavement, then you're listening to the wrong people. You know, now again, I'm not one of these like, I'm not a new ager in any way. I do not believe in like finding your inner light or your inner truth. In fact, I think some of that is actually kind of dangerous. Even though I do believe that we kind of all have like an inner light to us, I do think that's important. I do think that self-actualization is important. But in my mind, that comes from, you know, aligning oneself with God. So evil is not going to overthrow God. That cannot happen. That will not happen. Evil may consider God to be its enemy, but it's not attacking God. It attacks us, you know? And we got to keep that in mind. And, you know, if you believe in the evil one, right? And I mean, I do, right? I mean, he's not sitting around. He is actively engaged in trying to steal us from God. That's what I believe. And I believe that his attack on us happens individually and collectively. So like he tries to steal each of us from God, but then collectively he tries to steal humanity from God. And I believe that evil is everywhere. You know, we can't we can't lose our minds like thinking about this. Like you can't allow yourself to lose all hope by just like becoming black pilled, to use that term, right? You can't do that. I say all the time, there's reason to be hopeful. You can be optimistic, but to be optimistic, you have to have a realistic appraisal of where we are. Hi, Rose. Come. He's downstairs. I can hear him like whining. You have to be like, come here, please. Good boy. You have to be, again, if you don't have an accurate understanding of where we are and what's actually going on, then you're not optimistic. You're naive. So I've rambled on a lot, but this is kind of my closing point. Let me tie together what I was talking about with incompetence and then worldview. It's not incompetence, okay? It's not incompetence in like what DoD leaders are doing right now. It's not incompetence. What US government leaders are doing right now, it's not incompetence. What these people who run the world that are super evil are doing, it's not incompetence, okay? It's deliberate. When you call them incompetent, in my mind, you sound foolish. You don't know what you're talking about, okay? Another course that I did when I was a major, not the School of Advanced Military Studies, but another course I did a couple years earlier when I was a major. I had a very smart instructor. He was a retired Marine colonel, career in intelligence, very, 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 smart individual, extremely cerebral thinker. And he said something, and this, in my mind, it's like common sense, right? But we were talking about North Korea, which was interesting to me at the time because I was getting ready to go be stationed in Korea, and I spent 3 years in South Korea. So we're talking about North Korea at the time. I know I'm actually headed to Korea, so I'm certainly paying attention. And he says, hey, when you talk about the Kim family, they're not crazy. They're not irrational. Now, they may be diabolical. They may be evil. They're not irrational. They're very calculated. You're talking about some of the smartest people on the planet. When it comes to average IQ of the people, they're not crazy. They're not irrational. They don't act irrationally. They are very strategic in their calculations about what they're doing. I think that's completely true. Now, where I think that kind of breaks down is, I don't know what's going on with Korea. I don't know that the Kim family is making their own decisions. I have no idea. I asked myself, and I spent 3 years over there. And I had a very interesting job while I was over there. And it gave me kind of a peek behind the curtain in some ways as to what's going on in Korea. But not enough of a peek behind the curtain that I could really tell you what is actually going on. I don't know. And at some point we'll talk more about that. Because I think Korea is fascinating. I do. And I have, a great respect for the South Korean people that I got to know really well while I was over there. And it was a cool place to be. But that aside, let's just take the kind of, surface deep understanding of that, because I think that's important. What he says in application to Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, or Kim Jong-il's father, Kim Il-sung, could be applied to the U.S. government, or more narrowly to like DoD leaders, or to whoever is kind of, in the shadows orchestrating so much of what goes along around the world. They're not incompetent. They're very evil. They act in an extremely diabolical way, but they're very cold and calculated and strategic in their decisions to do what they do. They do not care about you or me. They want to destroy our freedom. They want to enslave us for reasons that perhaps we can go into at another time. And if you think that I'm off my rocker, okay, you can disagree with me. That's cool too. And here's the other thing. I may be inaccurate in some of the stuff that I say or some of the stuff that I, kind of surmise or assume. I mean, I always reserve the right to be wrong, or when I engage with additional information, of course I may refine my opinions. I mean, my opinions are different now than they were 2-3 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. I'm just telling you that right now, what I've laid out to you is my general worldview. There are evil people out there. They hate God. They hate humanity because we were created by God in God's image. They know they can't fight God directly. They very much can fight us, and they do. They do that through spiritual warfare. One of the main ways in which they carry out that spiritual warfare is through worldview warfare. And they do that by attacking the way in which we can accurately view the world and our view of politics. That's why I hold little hope in the US government fixing itself, because I think it's just so far gone. I just think it's infiltrated by extremely evil people. It's completely controlled. That doesn't mean that every single person in the US government is completely controlled. I mean, no, that's ridiculous. But I do believe that many people are influenced by money or power, or they are just they're cowards and they're not going to stand up and do the right thing. And then there are those who actually are high enough that they are willingly part of the destruction of the United States. I think these shadow organizations that run the world. I mean, you hear terms like New World Order, et cetera. I think that's a real thing, right? Americanism is an obstacle to that, and I think there's a lot wrong with America. And I'm a patriotic, freedom-loving American here. I love American history. I like learning about the founding. I wish more people had a true understanding of the founding and the Constitution, et cetera. I think the Constitution could be improved, but I am a constitutionalist because I think if we were to get back to the Constitution, it would be an enormous change from where we are now. But it's going to require a ton of work to get there. But it's not going to be easy. We can't fool ourselves into thinking how we're going to get out of this. And so, just in summation, things are bad, and it's not incompetence. Those who are against us, they're not incompetent. And if you believe that there's some sort of communication going on with evil entities, then you're talking about spiritual entities that have been around a long time. They're clearly not, unintelligent or whatever, right? We have to be realistic in our appraisal of what's going on. Now, if you look at the world and your worldview is not necessarily theistic, then of course, I would disagree with that. I mean, I don't apologize for my own worldview, but I still would say, kind of take out the theological underpinnings. Even so, you might still agree with me that there are evil people who are seeking to control the world and have seemingly like unlimited resources and assets at their disposal, enough they can pretty much leverage power and influence against pretty much any nation or any political leader that is recognized by the people. I think that's all I have to say. So just understand, when people use terms like mind control, that's not just old school brainwashing like you might see in movies or whatever. It's part of it, right? But there is direct cognitive attacks being done on us. It's real, okay? And it's because they want you to operate from an impaired worldview, because then that affects your decision making. They want you to be a slave. They want me to be a slave. I don't want to be a slave. I don't want you to be a slave. And I hope that you don't want you to be a slave. So we're gonna have to band together. It's gonna take a lot of work. It's not gonna be easy. I believe in being a Christian man of action. It's kind of why I do what I do. I believe God wins. And I try to do the best that I can to keep myself aligned with God. I'm not perfect in any way, like at all. I don't tend to be. I'm not. I'm a human being. I fail. Whatever. But I just try to do what I can do. No. So Cairo says it's time to get off of here. He gives his agreement to what I'm saying, and we'll go ahead and sign off for the night. All right, have a good one.